Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Today we are beginning our discussion of media effects. This is a very exciting time in Poly MCS 326 because this unit, this next sort of 3 weeks of content, is really going to take us through a variety of really important questions about how it is that this media ecosystem, information environment, what have you, is actually transmitting information to the public. And so we've thought a lot about how these things are set up, what their sort of institutional profiles are, contours, what's in them, or what constitutes the media, and how we might theorize those institutions and their power, and how they interact with other institutions, both intermediary and governmental, and of course the public. But now, as we move into this discussion of agenda setting, I want to think again about how media, as we broadly conceive it, influences what the public knows, what the public thinks about, what the public talks about, and what kind of information the public uses to make, for example, voting decisions. So this is an incredibly consequential, incredibly important topic. And so we're beginning our discussion of these three different media effects. We'll talk about agenda setting, priming, and framing over the next few weeks with this sort of highest order media effect that we call agenda setting. And so to situate this discussion, I want to think about some big questions. And I go back usually when I'm thinking about big questions to the work of a guy named Robert Dahl, who was a political theorist, a political scientist who spent much of his time at Yale University. And really one of the things that Robert Dahl was most interested in his career was the question of what makes for a good modern democracy. And in much of his writing, he thought about trying to characterize good or consolidated or healthy democracies. He also called them polyarchies because he didn't think that democracy was really a standard that modern countries could really achieve feasibly. But in his characterization of a good, consolidated, strong polyarchy where the public or the people rule, he thought that popular control over the agenda was one of the most foundational things that we could have in order to guarantee democratic quality. And so with that, I mean that Robert Dahl was interested in answering the question for any given country, and the US in particular, who has the power to determine what gets talked about? And so this is a power that is different, perhaps, than many of the ways that we would otherwise characterize power. So oftentimes we think about power in terms of who gets what, when, and how. So the material outcomes of a policy process. That is, say there's a political decision about whether or not there's going to be money, say, for a COVID response. That is really about power and who gets what in terms of whether or not a check comes into your bank account or not. Right? You can think about all the political discussions and debates about COVID-19 stimulus responses, where that money's going ultimately, and who's eligible even for receiving that money. So this is a little bit different, though. This is actually sort of another order of power because it's not talking about who gets what. It's talking about what are we even talking about. Right? It's a little bit more abstract. It's really talking about whether we're talking about a COVID response or whether we're talking about some other issue at any given point in time. And so we need to think carefully about this when we think about media effects, because if we believe that this fourth estate, this journalistic press entity, the media out there, whatever that might be, however we might define it, and of course we know now that many different scholars define it differently. If we think that thing, that media entity, that press out there has some kind of power, maybe its power lies in the ability to determine what gets talked about, because that may interfere with popular control over the agenda, or it might amplify popular control over the agenda. It may be that journalistic agenda setting could help connect in terms of good linkage institutions, connect the public to government and vice versa. However, it might also mean that some things simply don't get talked about. And that's what we want to contend with today, is to think about this media agenda setting and consider what its qualities are, what its features are, its properties, and how those things might play out in real modern examples. So again, if we think broadly about agenda setting, we might ask ourselves, who actually could set the agenda if we conceive of the agenda broadly as the stuff that government is talking about, the stuff that government's paying attention to or addressing at any given point in time? We can think about maybe the media has a role, and certainly that's the purpose of today's discussion, but there's all sorts of other stakeholders that we can think about that are also important potentially in influencing what we as a society are talking about at any given time. So incumbent politicians, certainly, they're very powerful. As we've seen in the last couple modules, they have the ability to go public and try to influence public opinion through their own agendas. Maybe they want to talk about an issue or a concept or a policy that no one else is talking about, and therefore spark a discussion by themselves. Maybe candidates also, they want to try to steer the agenda and think about, during election time, what are we talking about when we go to vote at the polls? It could be a very important kind of goal for campaign communicators, and especially this, as we talked about, this class of campaign consultants who are seeking to craft persuasive advertising, which seeks to control the agenda during the election. We could also think about political party organizations and the broader sort of party institution that's attempting to make sure that their partisans win office in later elections. They might have a role here. And also interest groups, these other formal linkage institutions, which are seeking to start a debate or a discussion about their preferred policies in order to get government to go along with what they are interested in. Interest in emphasis here. And then finally, we can think about the public, you and me, just normal, everyday people who might come together collectively and think, hey, I noticed that there's this issue that seems to be a problem that exists in my daily life, and I want to raise this. I want to elevate this to the plane of discussion. I want to start talking about it and get others to start talking about it too. And maybe if we do that, we could see that it would have an effect on policy if this were to become the topic du jour, the thing that is talked about any given day. And so if we think about this choice set of who it is that's the agenda setter in a public, we start to realize that actually it's pretty consequential to think about who's doing this, especially as we'll see if we try to determine whether it's incumbent politicians who are having a strong effect on what the public is talking about at any given time, or if it's the other way around, where the public are setting the agenda and therefore incumbent politicians are being forced to respond. This idea of response would be a pretty important thing in representative government. The idea that the public, right, the agenda originates with the public and it gets translated up to the level of incumbents, and then they craft policy based on what we, the people, want. Right? I think I've heard that we, the people thing somewhere, right? I wonder what famous political document in the United States begins with we, the people. If that's the case, if we, the people, set the agenda, then we've got maybe some positive democratic qualities that Robert Dahl might be happy about. If, however, it's somebody else that's really driving the discussion and determining, by and large, what's talked about at any given time, then we face a more complicated question, perhaps. So many, many people have been interested in this question, and many people as well, having theorized an independent role for the press in doing this, in having an effect on the agenda, have really looked into the way that journalist practices influence the agenda, or that is, influence what gets talked about on a given day and what doesn't get talked about on a given day. And of course, we've already talked a little bit about some of the behaviors of journalists, right? If you go back to Gantz's kind of sociological analysis of different journalists, and you go back to our discussion of news values, many people, many scholars have connected these kinds of sociological insights to the process of agenda setting. And they've said, look, if you think about the kinds of news values that we've got out here, the fact that we know that the press in America emphasizes timeliness, that fresh new stories are going to generally be more covered than old stories from weeks ago. The idea of horse race journalism, or the fact that in politics, often candidates and their conflicts are emphasized in journalism. Negativity, right? The idea that if it bleeds, it leads. Right? Journalists are really interested in emphasizing negativity in their coverage because it tends to attract attention, and in a very competitive media environment, that might sell newspapers or generate clicks or get revenue some other way. And then finally, conflict frames being a really important part of news values in today's political media, where you want to show that there's this back and forth, point counterpoint, because that conflict again also heightens the drama of political coverage. And so these news values, if you think about it, this affects the kind of thing that any journalist is going to be focusing on in a given moment. Because if there's something that is easier to cover using negativity and conflict frames and is timely, and just happens to involve, candidates battling it out on the campaign trail, they're going to be naturally, drawn to that story. And another story that's about something that maybe isn't as focally timely, that's not as much about a specific focal event on that day, right? Something that's happened over a long period of time, something that's more conceptual, that's harder for audiences to understand, that doesn't have this kind of conflict frame so readily baked in. Journalists are just not going to cover it as much. And so the agenda is being set in large part by the way that journalists respond to these incentives. And so news values are really important, we've seen time and time again in the research, in determining how the overall agenda is shaped. And so again, this is a kind of a collective action problem type story here, where individual journalists are all following along with these individual news values. But as a collective, because they're all gravitating towards certain flavors of stories, they tend to drive attention to some stories over others. And so we'll see maybe some examples in the reading of actual news stories where that has been the case. But this is just to say that media agenda setting is a very long studied and very important subject in the literature in political communication. Many scholars have been interested in this, and many scholars have posited that news values play a strong role in the agenda today. But if we think about this week's reading, the reading for this particular week of content, I think that there's a lot here to unpack that goes beyond just those basic observations that media play a role here. First of all, Boydston takes us a lot further. Amber Boydston is a scholar who's written extensively on agenda setting. And she has asked the question, what about this idea that the practices of journalists today seem to be shaping the agenda in a way that's maybe not quite as predictable as we might imagine? That there's certain practices of journalists that seem to go beyond just these news values that we've talked about, especially as we contend with these news explosions, where the agenda suddenly gets overwhelmed and oversaturated with attention to one specific policy area or one specific issue or one specific focus. So this is, I think, a really important piece and a very meaningful contribution to the literature on agenda setting, and a great place to start off our reading on the topic. And then we get into Jessica Fiesel's work, who is another scholar of media effects, who's done a really great job here of looking at the question of whether or not agenda setting works on social media. So one, I think, critique, and one thing we have to take seriously in all of our studies of media and politics today, is that even studies of agenda setting from 10 years ago are not fully compensating for the fact that most people now are filtering at least some of their information, not all as we've seen, but at least some of their information through a social media filter. And so Fiesel kind of updates us and brings us into the modern era and says, hey, agenda setting, we assume it works because, media sources, their journalists choose what to talk about, and then we consume our media through those sources. Well, in an era where Facebook, your friends post stuff and we read about it, is this still the case? And so we'll see the answer to that question in a moment. And then finally, we've got Pablo Barbera and his colleagues at New York University. Pablo Barbera is a scholar who is at University of Southern California currently, and is doing a lot of great work on social media itself and looking at Twitter specifically in this case, asking the question of whether the public can actually use Twitter to set the political agenda for legislators, or whether it seems from the evidence that we have on Twitter that it's legislators that are starting to talk about issues, and then the public follows up by responding and starting to make the conversation bigger. So does the public lead, or do legislators lead in terms of new issues coming on the agenda? That's an incredibly important question, and using the methodological tools available to us in the modern era, this team of scholars with Pablo Barbera as their lead has come up with a really fascinating new way to answer this age-old question of whether the public leads or whether legislators lead the discussion. And so together we've got a really interesting, I think, collection of readings about agenda setting. I just want to first of all talk through Amber Boydston's piece a little bit just to help ground your reading of that piece. So the first thing is to note that really Boydston's major argument here is that modern news, the way that modern news is created and the way that agenda setting functions today, actually seems not to match exactly what we'd expect if we thought that agenda setting operated, in response to news values. So we might expect that, journalists are moving from one topic to another. They're following audience demand. They're thinking about what's eye-catching. They're thinking about what's interesting. They're generally just setting the agenda on the basis of rational behavior, right? Just kind of following along with these traditional news values. But Boydston doesn't see that. And if you look at the examples that she's using in the book, the Terri Schiavo case and a couple of school shootings, other kind of really impactful news events from the early 2010s, actually, Boydston is observing that it seems like some of these news items tend to get gigantic amounts of coverage for a certain amount of time. And then those topics tend to stick around in coverage for this extended period of time, far after we would imagine timeliness considerations would mean that we're not thinking about that anymore. So this idea that there's these news explosions that then have these long, persistent tails of coverage into that topic, she would argue that this has really big implications for public opinion about certain topics, for all kinds of outcomes in terms of the way that we think about politics. And so I think that this is a pretty important piece because, again, it really gets into the theory of these news values, and it gets into the actual practices of journalists, kind of, again, in the spirit of Gantz's piece. And I think as we do this, as we study this, we need to ask ourselves the question, why is it that journalists seem to do this news explosion thing where they fixate on some topics over others? And so as you're reading, try to think about Boydston's answer to that question, especially when she asserts, and this is early in the chapter, you'll see this in a little inset. She says, political agendas are disproportionate information processing systems. That's a really complicated, fancy sounding concept there. And so I wonder, as you're reading, if you can unpack that and try to understand what she means by this. I'll give you a little bit of a hint here. She's talking about the fact that journalists tend to go into a thing called alarm mode in response to these specific events when they're responding in a political way. However, she makes the case that journalists sometimes get stuck after they respond to the alarm. And even though the alarm has long since turned off, they tend to continue to cover the same type of issue that got the alarm mode going in the first place. And so that's really the question I think we should consider here is, why is it that journalists tend to get stuck in this kind of on position when they're covering certain issues? And what does that tell us about the way that modern journalists do their jobs? It's a really important, I think, contribution to the literature on agenda setting, and it's especially great for our class because it really gets us thinking about connecting the dots between individual journalists' incentives and the outcomes at the large scale level that affect public opinion and affect the way that we think about politics on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's a great book. And if you're interested in this book, I've only given you the first chapter. You can read the rest of the book. You can get it from the library. You can check it out. I think it would be a great read for you. But of course, that's not the only thing I want you to read this week. I want you to also look at Jessica Fiesel's article in Political Research Quarterly. It's called, or I guess it's not called, but she's looking at the Facebook agenda. And so I think this is a great article for our purposes as well, because, again, it gets us into the possibility that audiences might be able to tune out of news consumption in online modes, meaning that traditional agenda setting, the way that maybe even Boydston describes it, doesn't really matter anymore in today's day and age. And so we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that all this talk about agenda setting and about media effects is overblown now that we've got Facebook and now that people can avoid maybe incidental exposure to news? So the kind of setup to this, and you can read the literature review in Professor Fiesel's article, you can see that over time, a lot of scholars, Marcus Pryor and other people, have been concerned about this question of whether or not people can tune out news. Because we've got a certain group of people in the United States today that are super interested in news and that are super news junkies. And then we've got the other side of the coin, as we'll talk about more later in the semester. We've got a group of people out there who are really news averse, who say, I don't want to know, don't tell me. If I see the news, I turn it off, I change the channel. I just want wall-to-wall entertainment. I don't want any news. It's negative, it's nasty, it's divisive, it's gross, turn it off. And so the worry is that this second group of people, the people who are otherwise incidentally exposed to news and therefore learn a little more about politics over the long term, are able to hyper curate their content by unfollowing their friends that talk about news or what have you, so that there's no news that ever gets in their systems. And so Feazell asks, do audiences still get influenced by the agenda setting of journalists or agenda setting practices in the first place if they're getting their news primarily through Facebook? And so she designs a really interesting experiment, a really interesting study that benefits from this longitudinal analysis of Facebook users and is able to demonstrate the answers to some stylized questions that I have for you. And so I know there's a lot of data in this. There's like a whole method and research design. And at some point, you're going to reach one of those dreaded tables with stars and all these numbers. Don't worry about it. I think that when you're reading this, I want you to focus on what Dr. Feazell thinks about the answers to these two questions. And so she's got these listed as research hypotheses. And so I've paraphrased these for you a little bit. You'll see, somewhere in the middle of this paper, you'll see these two hypotheses that are listed here. And I've paraphrased them to read a little bit more like this. H1, the first hypothesis, or the first kind of educated guess that Professor Feazell is interested in answering, will people who see certain issues pop up on Facebook think those issues are politically important? So essentially, this is a question that she's going to try to answer through her careful manipulation of the actual stuff that people see on Facebook. So she's going to show people stuff that pertains to certain issues, and then she's going to ask them after they've seen that stuff in their news feeds over time, hey, do you think this stuff is politically important? And she wants to know, does it actually work? Right? If people see this stuff in their news feeds, if it comes through, does it register with Facebook users, even when their walls are full of all this other content, all this entertainment? And the second hypothesis, to paraphrase this, she's interested especially in whether those politically uninterested people, the people that are like, get rid of news, I don't want news, are those people going to be more likely than anybody else to have their beliefs about what's important influenced by this certain issue stuff popping up on their Facebook feeds? So is it really among the people who might, evince this effect or have this effect happen to them, is it especially the uninterested, the people who are turned off and tuned out of news? Are they the ones that are going to remember this stuff? It seems a little bit counterintuitive, but if you read her theoretical argument in the paper, you'll see why she thinks that it's the uninterested that are going to be the most affected when they're incidentally exposed. So I think it's an interesting study, and read on to find the answers. I think that the answers are certainly consequential, and I'll just give you a little hint, right? There's a reason why we're still talking about agenda setting effects today, and that might be in part because of what Professor Feazell finds. And really, just this article and this discussion in the first place, I think, is a preview of some coming attractions. And really, by that, I mean that we're going to talk later in the course about some concepts, including fragmentation of the media environment and selective exposure, wherein individuals are getting to choose their news more than before. And so we've talked a little bit about this 24-hour news cycle that never existed in the past, the idea that we've got so many sources now, and you can consume news nonstop if you'd like to. So part of the worry here is that there are so many news outlets and so many news channels and so many websites that no two people are going to learn the same things, right? The media agenda is hopelessly fragmented into a million pieces. And so there's actually no common dialogue, right? It's no longer the case that we're all generally having the same conversation about the same things, because there's no, big three, ABC, CBS, NBC networks that are just talking about certain topics of the day. And then that's what everybody's thinking about, and that's what everyone knows about. So a big concern is, are people still on the same page, or are we just hopelessly in our own kind of bubbles where we're thinking and talking about totally different topics at any given time? And so the Feazell piece, I think, speaks a little bit to that idea of incidental exposure, and the idea that even if we are able to be very selective in terms of what we're listening to and we're hearing on any given day, it may be the case that even then we're still sometimes getting pinged with stuff that we didn't intend to hear. And so this idea of incidental exposure will come back again and again this semester. For now, we at least have some evidence from this piece that incidental exposure is real, and it seems to have an impact on audiences who remember stuff when they're instantly exposed to it. So maybe a good news story so far, but as we catch up with this topic of incidental exposure and fragmentation in the near future, we'll see whether that holds up. Moving on, I think we want to also think about agenda setting and its ability to influence government policy. And so, again, I want to just introduce the Barbera et al. Article in just a moment by thinking about, again, this idea that agenda setting in a good democracy is hopefully some kind of two-way street between mass publics and elites of some kind. And so if we go back to the First Amendment, you might be surprised to learn that the First Amendment actually contains a wide variety of different freedoms, including freedom of speech, religious expression, the press, freedom of assembly, and this one that's a little bit more kind of funky in terms of its wording, the freedom to petition government for the redress of grievances. And that is essentially the freedom to ask government to fix problems, right? For the redress of grievances, that is, to fix problems. And so when problems arise, agenda setting is essentially the process by which the public starts to say, hey, don't focus on that other stuff. Focus on this problem that we've identified that is a problem. Redress our grievances. We're here. We're using our First Amendment freedoms to ask you to fix it. And so if you're out here thinking about, a bill that would give everybody a puppy, and you're not thinking about solving this problem, then you're not responsive as a government. And so if we think about agenda setting as a two-way street, we should think about the possibility for the public to determine whether the federal government is talking about any issue that is of concern to the public. So Barbera et al. Get to test this question of whether this is a two-way street, whether it is the case that the public originate problems and then move that problem and its discussion up to the level of governance, or whether it's government telling the public what to be worried about. Because if it's the latter, that's not very good in terms of responsiveness. It's not responsiveness at all. That's the government saying, hey, everyone, we should be really concerned that we're all not eating enough cheese. And then everybody says, yes, let's have a debate about cheese and we'll all go buy more cheese. That's not good, right? That's a kind of top-down process of agenda setting. Whereas the public might say, hey, what's going on with cheese prices? Cheese prices are too high. We want you to fix this. And they create they elevate the problem from their concerns and their recognition that cheese prices are too high to the government, who then says, okay, now we're going to talk about cheese prices because everybody's mad about it, and we'll go do something to fix it. Hopefully they'll fix it, or they might create some sort of problem with interference in the market for dairy, which, by the way, is a real thing that actually happened when there were giant lakes of cheese that were eventually processed into kind of craft singles and distributed to people all over the United States. Crazy story, but true. So Barbera wants to know, is it people that are starting the conversation about cheese, or is it the government that's mandating that everybody talk about cheese by leading the conversation? And actually, the Twitter platform is a fantastic place to study that, because we can look at in real time when tweets are posted and when government agents start talking about that stuff and when the public has started talking about that stuff. And it's interesting because Barbera et al. Go further than just saying public government, right? Official government sources, just the mass of people on Twitter. They actually distinguish between several different kinds of publics. And so one is what they might call the general public, that is just random users on Twitter. The second one is what they call the attentive public, that is a group of Twitter users who seem to be a little more sophisticated than average because they follow news organizations. Their follow interactions tend to be fairly thoughtful in terms of their news saturation relative to the average Twitter user. And then finally, they're able to use a clever task or a clever tool here to determine whether these party supporters are actually partisans or not. So they're looking at whether or not Twitter users follow members of one party exclusively or whether they don't. And they do some additional footwork to follow up on seeing if that actually does identify Twitter partisans or not. And it seems to actually do a pretty good job. So they want to know, right? Is it the mass public, everybody? Is it the attentive public, or is it partisan supporters that are most influential in setting the agenda for public legislators. Or again, if it's the other way around, if it's the public legislators are the ones that are causing the general public or the attentive public or even party supporters to start talking about a given issue. So who talked about cheese first is the question, if everybody's suddenly talking about cheese. And this paper is really complicated. It's got a lot of really fancy math. I just wanted to briefly mention Table 2. If you look at this, they identify 100 issues that people are talking about during the period of analysis in the Twitterverse. And it's interesting because they took thousands and thousands and thousands of tweets, and they were able to identify these topic clusters, about 100 of them, using machine learning, which means that they didn't read thousands and millions of tweets. They made a computer read them, and they made them cluster them together into these specific bundles, and then those bundles spat out specific words that were most discriminating or the most important in determining what made that bundle a bundle. And it turns out that of all of these different terms, you can see in that table, there's all kinds of different political issues that come out in there. And so then for all of those political issues, those clusters of political issues, they looked to see, based on the timestamps of tweets where those discriminating terms were being used, whether it was members of the public that were talking about them first in an increasing density, where suddenly it's like, oh, the public's retweeting stuff about this issue. They're creating a grievance redressing moment, opportunity, or whether it's the politicians who are first starting to ramp up their tweets about that issue. And so it turns out, drum roll, that I'm not going to tell you who leads and who follows in that article. I encourage you to go into the article and read the conclusions to figure out who does what, because I think that the conclusions of this article have massive implications for the questions in modern times that we have about who sets the agenda. And really, I think leads us to broader questions again, all the way back to the very first day of class about whether or not our media democracy is a democracy of high or low quality. And so that's what I'll leave you with, is just this last question. We've thought about the Feazell article, we've thought about the Barbera article, we've even thought about the Boydson article, and about the way that new technology also leads to an increase in news explosions and all that stuff. I want to know your answer to the question, whether you think that these recent developments in the information environment itself, whether the sort of increasingly online nature of agenda setting means that our agenda setting process is more democratic in the United States today or less democratic. So I'll leave you to ponder that question about the quality of democracy until we meet next week. I hope that you have a wonderful time, and I very much look forward to your thoughts on this topic. See you soon.